Very good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. It's the first 2021 New Work on the Roman Republic seminar. And it's a great pleasure to be welcoming Professor Dean Cornell this evening. And indeed, it's a pleasure to be welcoming a number of colleagues and friends that have joined the seminar mailing list over the last few days. Tim Cornell is a figure of such a distinction and importance in our field that really any presentation is barely necessary. Of course, his name is
unnecessary.
Well, indeed, and I shall keep it suitably brief. Of course, his name is associated with two milestones really in Roman studies, not just in the study of the Roman Republic. His great book, The Beginnings of Rome, 1995, in many ways the go-to place for any proper study of early Rome, any early and mid-Republican Rome. And of course, the fragments of the Roman historians, major 3-volume work, which he was the general editor, published in 2013. But then, of course, Tim is the sort of scholar that really changes the terms of the debate whenever he tackles a problem. And so whether we are looking at the foundation myth of Rome, the Aeneas tradition, or we're looking at the Lex Ovinia, or indeed the impact of the Hannibalic War on Italy, Tim will have quite simply changed the terms of the debate through his work on those particular topics. And of course, as well as having had such a tremendously distinguished and influential scholarly trajectory, Tim has a long-standing history of important and indeed distinguished service to the field, more broadly, through the senior roles he had at the British School at Rome and at the Institute of Classical Studies in London, and of course, more recently, through his leadership role at the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies, of which has been the president since 2018. We are delighted that he has agreed to open this new series of our new work seminar, that he's agreed to present an aspect of his work in progress on the Roman dictatorship and on the institutional history of early and mid-Republican Rome. The title of his talk this evening is Further Thoughts on Roman Dictatorship. Tim, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you very much. Well, and thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be able to do this, even though I can't actually be there in person, which is a great shame, because that takes most of the fun out of giving these papers. On the other hand, it does mean that people from all over the place can tune in, and it's very interesting to see old friends who probably unwisely think it's a good idea to tune into this. Anyway, let's go on to dictatorship, and I'll start with the problems of definition. What is a dictator? One could go into this endlessly, but basically, I think it's a bit like pornography. You know it when you see it, and you know, I give you here a few choice 20th century examples, who I won't need to name, and they give you the general idea of what we mean by a dictator: a non-royal autocrat who exercises extreme absolute power. He does so by decree and in perpetuity, and he's answerable to no authority other than his own. I'm saying he, whether there have ever been any female dictators, I don't know, but it usually is a he, for heaven's sake, and certainly in Roman times it was. The word dictator, of course, is Latin, and it's used to describe political despots. Goes back to the historical example of the men who set themselves up at the end of the Roman Republic as dictators, Sulla and Caesar. But the type of dictatorship that they established must be distinguished from the original form of the office as it existed in the earlier republic. Now, this was the famous emergency measure called upon in times of crisis, so they say, when the Romans would appoint a dictator to hold supreme power until he'd ended the emergency, or for 6 months, whichever was the shorter. Many famous examples, but the most famous of all from the early republic is that of Cincinnatus, the man who was called from the plough to assume the dictatorship and to save the consul and his army who were being besieged, which he very shortly did. And Cincinnatus has always been throughout history an example of somebody who dedicated himself to the public good without any expectation of reward and gave up as soon as his job was done. And the most famous comparison of all is with George Washington, who in 1775 was called from retirement at Mount Vernon to lead the Continental Army. And he did so without salary until 1783, when he resigned his commission and returned to his estate. So he's always been known in American tradition as Cincinnatus, and hence the title of the book by Gary Wills that you see on the screen. When he resigned, his successor, Henry Knox, together with the other officers who'd served under him, founded what they called the Society of the Cincinnati, and they made Washington their first president. In 1790, one of the founder members, Arthur St. Clair of Losantiville, Ohio, decided to rename his hometown, and that is why it's known to this day as Cincinnati. Washington was also praised for his decision not to seek a third term in 1796 as President of the United States, and instead to retire to private life, thus ensuring a peaceful and orderly transmission to his successor, John Adams, and created the tradition that until a few weeks ago has been followed ever since. Now, the traditional Roman dictatorship has impressed modern political theorists who always marveled at the efficacy of this method of dealing with crises. Machiavelli, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Alexander Hamilton, and many, many others have praised the efficacy of this wonderful institution. But the first to define its nature in contrast to absolute sovereign power, this is the point of the distinction I was making at the beginning, was Jean Bodin in 1576, who stressed the limitation of the dictatorship, its 6-month duration, and the fact that the dictator's task was always defined and restricted to a specific commission for the purpose of restoring the normal functioning of the republic. So this wonderful text where we have the second paragraph. I'm going to break the golden rule that I've always observed, actually, of whatever you do in a seminar, don't say anything in French. But anyway, en cas, quoi, il appert que le dictateur n'est ni prince ni magistrat souverain, comme plusieurs ont écrit, et ne voit rien qu'une simple commission pour faire la guerre ou réprimer la sédition. Okay. Now, Bodin's very positive assessment was the inspiration for Carl Schmitt, the most famous theorist of the subject of dictatorship, whose work, Die Diktatur, was published in 1921. So we're celebrating, I think, a rather gloomy centenary here. Now, following Bodin, Schmitt famously distinguished two types of dictatorship: commissary dictatorship, kommissarische Diktatur, and sovereign dictatorship, souveräner Diktatur. The former, a temporary commission conferred in a state of exception, Ausnahmezustand, conferred on an individual to deal with a specific crisis in order to restore the status quo ante. While the latter, the sovereign dictator, was a new and permanent rearrangement of state institutions in order to produce an autocratic and effective form of government in perpetuity. Now, Schmidt was an enthusiast for both types of dictatorship, especially the second, which became flesh in the person of his friend Adolf Hitler. Schmidt became the leading jurist of the Third Reich, and throughout his long life, he died in 1985, aged 97, unrepentant, and produced new and virtually unchanged editions of his book in the 60s and 70s. The work remains extremely influential. It's never been out of print. And it was finally, and this is amazing, in 2014 was translated into English. So if you want a really grim read, this Praise of Dictatorship for 300 pages is there. Now, Schmidt's distinction between two types of dictatorship was based on the historical record of the early Roman dictators, such as Cincinnatus or Fabius Maximus on the one hand, and autocrats like Caesar and Sulla on the other. But as Wilfried Nippel has pointed out, this was not his own original insight, as he claimed, but was lifted wholesale and without acknowledgement from who else? Mommsen, who in the Staatsrecht, the second volume of first edition of 1877, this is a picture from my own wonderful copy of the third edition, but I couldn't resist putting this splendid portrait of old Mommsen overseen by a bust of Caesar, working away and with pieces of screwed up paper on the floor. This portrait dates from a couple of years later than the first edition of the Staatsrecht. Now, Mommsen dealt with the traditional dictatorship in his chapter, a series of chapters on the various magistrates, the regular magistracies, so that we have the consulate, then the dictatorship, then the magister equitum, then the consular tribunes, then the praetors, then the provincial governors, and so on. Whereas the rule of Sulla and Caesar was lumped together in a different chapter, together with the decemvirate and the triumvirate as exceptionally constituted powers, außer ordentlichen konstituierenden Gewalten. Now, this distinction between early dictatorship and Sulla Caesar's autocracy, in spite of attempts to undermine it by Wilken, Nicolai, more recently Urlay and others, in my opinion, remains wholly valid. In fact, the contrast between the dictatorship of the early republic and the autocratic regimes of Sulla and Caesar is, in my view, much stronger than Baudin, Mommsen, Schmidt, or anyone else have ever imagined. Now, what everyone has agreed upon in the past is that the traditional dictatorship was an emergency measure invoked only in times of crisis. Most Roman historians, I think, would accept this as a general statement. For instance, this recent 2013 book by Gregory Golden, which I'm afraid to say is very disappointing on the dictatorship. He's a bit like Livy's readers and wants to get on to the late Republic and the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, etc. And his grasp, I think, of the problems of the early Republic is really not very good. So it's a disappointingly conventional picture of the dictatorship. And this conventional picture has, I think, never been seriously challenged until recently. And I published a few years ago an article which I hope sort of spifflicated it. And I intend just to summarize the main features of that article now. The basic point, because I think the conventional picture is completely wrong and misrepresents the function and purpose of the dictatorship in the early years. In the early Republic, the dictatorship was a frequent device, and there were nearly 90 of them recorded in the 300 years from 501 to 202, when the last dictator held office. After that, it lapsed until Sulla. Now, the earliest dictatorships in the first 100 years or so, down to around 370, are relatively infrequent and of doubtful historicity. The episode of Cincinnatus, for instance, is almost certainly a legendary morality tale. And the dictatorships of Camillus, for instance, he's a record holder. He held it 5 times, supposedly. He's actually a very shadowy figure, and I think most of his dictatorships are pretty dubious. And then again, at the other end, after 300 BC, the dictatorship fades out of existence. The dictatorship as properly understood. There are some instances in the 3rd century, but they're mostly exceptional. I'll say more about this in a moment. So that when Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator to deal with the emergency after the Battle of Trasimene, the Romans were even then reviving a moribund institution that had not been used like this for more than 2 generations. The heyday of the dictatorship, in fact, was the period of 60 years from 366 to 302. That may not sound like 60 years to you, but believe me, it is, and I'll explain that afterwards if anybody really wants to know. Anyway, in this period of 60 years, there were some 40 dictatorships. That's to say, in 2 out of every 3 years, or every 18 months, there was a dictatorship. But most Roman historians, I think, would be hard-pressed to say what had given rise to these appointments and what the dictators in question actually did. I've given a list of just a brief period there, 20 years with 14 dictatorships from 361 to 340 BC on the left column. The next column is the years ab urbe condita, taken from Wikipedia, that very useful source, actually based on a dissertation published in America, not published, but written in America in the 80s, which is actually rather useful. And the information in this Wikipedia article is perfectly sound. These people, the list of dictators down the next column and their magistri equitum in the next. I'm sorry about the top row. I don't know why the color was different. I've been unable to change that, but anyway, I hope you can read them all. These people are not really well known, I don't think. They're not household names. No doubt they were at the time, certainly in their own households, but they are, I think, to us, relatively obscure figures. And I think, if you examine the record in Livy, who is the source for all this, you will see that actually they were not appointed in emergencies, and what they were doing is something much more routine. The idea that they were emergency appointments to deal with crises is false for 2 reasons. First, because Livy does not bear it out, as I've said, and secondly, because there's something absolutely absurd in the idea that in this era of increasing prosperity and continuous imperial expansion, this is the age, after all, when Rome conquered Italy, that every 18 months on average, there occurred an emergency so critical that a dictator had to be appointed to save the Republic from extinction. And this long series of dictatorships is not to be taken as a sign that the Romans were continually beset by critical emergencies or as evidence of their success in dealing with them. So the question is, who were these guys and what were they up to? Well, the answer, to my way of thinking, is simple. At this period, Rome had only a limited number of senior magistrates in each year, 2 consuls and 1 praetor. And if a situation arose where the magistrates were not available for some necessary task, the only remedy was to appoint a dictator. The appointment could be to provide an additional magistrate if something cropped up and the regular magistrates were already engaged on other tasks, for instance, a 3rd front in Rome's military activity, or if one of the regular magistrates was incapacitated through illness or even death, a replacement could be simply provided by means of a dictatorship. Now, in some cases, these may have been serious critical emergencies, if you want to put it like that. In 362 BC, the consul Ganusius was defeated and killed in a battle, and Appius Claudius Crassus was named dictator to rectify the situation, which he did with a hard-won victory, according to Livy. But these instances are extremely rare in the record. And I can give you another way of looking at this. In the century from 366 to 264, there were 75 triumphs, but only 5 of them were celebrated by dictators. And this, there are other statistics that prove the same point, but it's a clear demonstration of the lack of correlation between dictatorships and serious military emergencies. Indeed, the correlation is actually negative. When there was a serious military situation, it was the consuls that dealt with it. The record as we have it shows that the great majority of dictators were appointed to carry out routine functions or to replace or to work alongside the existing magistrates. Sometimes it was to conduct a military campaign, but only rarely was it a major military campaign. Otherwise, they dealt with tasks such as holding elections, and you can see in the third column here the different, where we've got information, why they were appointed. Now, re gerundae causa means in order to get the job done, a sort of vague designation of carrying out the commission, and that is normally assumed to be a military task. Otherwise, our record, and particularly the Capitoline Fasti, record these routine or ritual tasks that they sometimes had to carry out. For instance, in 351, Marcus Fabius Ambustus was appointed Comitiorum Habendorum Causa, that is to hold elections. The same for the next 3 years. Then in 344, we have a guy, Valerius Publicola, famous name, but just a descendant, who was having to organize the game, the festivals, Feriarum Constituerum Causa, which is the manufactured entry. The Capitoline Fasti don't exist for this, but that's what Livy says, and so on and so on. They could sometimes be appointed to hold games or to fix a nail in the temple of Jupiter, and putting a nail in the wall was a ritual that had to be carried out every year on the 11th of September. And if there was nobody available, it had to be carried out by the senior magistrate in the state, the Praetor Maximus, who would normally be the consul holding the fasces at the time. But if he was unavailable, then they would appoint a dictator for that task. Okay, that is quite known, well known, but my point is that most of the dictators re gerundae causa were also routine functionaries carrying out tasks that the consuls were unwilling or unable to carry out. And that mostly, even when it was re gerundae causa, they were minor military tasks or civic tasks. And in the event of a major war, the consuls were careful to ensure that they got the chance to conduct the campaign. In any case, the dictators re gerundae causa became less frequent in the later 4th century, and by 300, as I've said, they'd been phased out altogether. And the dictators in the 3rd century that we know about were all appointed either to hold elections or to knock nails in the wall. The explanation for this is that a much better method had been found to achieve the same result, namely the appointment of pro-magistrates. By the end of the 4th century, the Senate had achieved a tight grip on the conduct of state policy and was able to define each magistrate's task more precisely. This is the origin of the concept of provincia. The Senate assigned provinces to the elected magistrates, and if more commanders were needed, they were able to prorogue their commands, to extend them beyond their year as consul or praetor, or even to confer imperium pro praetore on former magistrates who were now living as private citizens, so that the idea of privati cum imperio becomes prevalent at the beginning of the 3rd century, the first time in the crisis of 295, which was the year of the Battle of Sentinum, a genuine emergency, I may say, which, if the traditional view had any substance, ought surely to have called for a dictator. Okay, there is another page, yes, I thought so. Now, the dictatorship survived in the 3rd century in a desiccated form, when the dictators, as I say, almost exclusively had a ceremonial function, holding elections, games, festivals, or fixing ritual nails in the temple wall. A residual memory, I think, survived of the archaic function of the dictator as an important military leader, if needed, in stories like that of Cincinnatus. But actually, I think it's important to point out that the fame of Cincinnatus, and if somebody in the 19th century were going to paint a picture of Cincinnatus, it would not be of his great victory. The battle against the Aequi is purely imaginary in Livy, and he just has to invent a situation, or somebody invented a situation where Cincinnatus could win a great victory. But what he's really remembered for, of course, is being called from the plough. He was appointed and took office reluctantly. He was going on about, you know, what about my parsnips and so on, and want to carry on a bit of agriculture. But the Senate persuaded him to take on the dictatorship, and he then carried out his task and was back ploughing within 15 days, famously. So the really important thing about Cincinnatus that was always remembered and continued in the time of George Washington was he was called from the plough reluctantly to take command, and was anxious just to get back into private life, and did so selflessly. So even Cincinnatus, I think, does not really stand as an example of somebody appointed to deal with a serious military emergency. That is sort of secondary. And it's interesting that Cicero refers to this story of being called from the plough, etc., refers it to Cincinnatus's second dictatorship, when he was supposedly, I think this is a late annalistic fabrication actually, but he was supposedly made dictator at the time of Spurius Maelius, the demagogue, one of the would-be kings, who had to be put down in 439, so a slightly later date. And Cicero, who of course used this example of a demagogue being put down, he was killed without trial by the Magister Equitum. Cicero, of course, liked this story for his own reasons and assumed that that was the occasion when Cincinnatus was called from the plough. In other words, the point I'm making is being called from the plough, finishing early and going back into retirement is the whole point of the story of Cincinnatus. Nevertheless, I think some memory of a dictator being a useful expedient, if there really were a crisis, did survive. And it was revived after the Battle of Trasimene in 217, when Fabius Maximus was given supreme command against Hannibal. And it was this that no doubt gave rise to the probably false notion that the existing magistrates had to submit to the dictator's authority. That's not entirely certain, but also when Sulla revived the dictatorship in a completely new form, it gave rise to the equally false, I'm sure equally false idea that the dictator had the right to execute citizens without appeal and was not subject to the tribunician veto or any other restraint. I think the record actually shows that the early dictators were indeed subject to tribunician vetoes and to interference by tribunes. And the point about appeal, I think, is something I won't go into at the moment. What I'm arguing here is that the sources got it all wrong, because the sources were, just like their modern successors, absolutely certain that the purpose of the dictatorship was to deal with serious critical situations. Here's Cicero in the De Legibus with his sort of artificial archaic Latin, laying down the law for a constitution, i.e. the Roman Republic. But when a serious war or civil dissensions arise, one man shall hold for no longer than 6 months the power which ordinarily belongs to the 2 consuls, if the Senate shall so decree. and after being appointed under favorable auspices, he shall be master of the people. Magister Populi is the old original title of the dictator. He shall have an assistant who command the cavalry, whose rank shall be equal to that of the administrator of justice. That is the Juris Disceptator, an alternative title in Cicero's constitution for the praetor. Okay, that's Cicero. Then Claudius, in his famous speech to the Senate about the admission of Gallic senators, gives a little history of the Roman constitution and says it's full of innovation. So why shouldn't I produce an innovation? What need now for me to remind you how the power of the dictatorship, greater even than that of the consuls, was invented by our forefathers for use in the more dangerous wars and the more serious civil commotions. Okay, so again, the idea that that's the point of the dictatorship. And we have Appian. They used to call such officials dictators, an office created in the most alarming emergencies for 6 months only, which had long since fallen into disuse. That is at the time when Sulla took it on. And finally, Livy, in an aside, when these things had been reported at Rome amid excitement even greater than the situation warranted, the Senate at once had recourse to its final counsel in emergencies, in rebus trepidis ultimum consilium, and ordered the appointment of a dictator. Now, I'm arguing that this is completely wrong, that this is not what dictators were for in the early days. And I'm asking the question, why did the sources get it so wrong? What explanation can there be? And the way I'm going to approach this is to take another error, which we know is definitely an error, and to see if we can explain that about the dictatorship. And this, I think, will give us a clue to what's going on in general. We look now at Polybius. Now, Polybius talks about the dictatorship in the context of the aftermath of Trasimene, when Fabius Maximus was appointed. And he gives this little aside to explain to his readers what a dictator is. A dictator differs from the consuls in these respects, that while each of the consuls is attended by 12 lictors, the dictator has 24. And that while the consuls require in many matters the cooperation of the Senate, the dictator is a general with absolute powers, strategos autocrator. All the magistrates in Rome, except the tribunes, ceasing to hold office on his appointment. Okay, that is an egregious error. On the appointment of a dictator, the other magistrates did not cease to hold office. And it's very interesting that Polybius makes this error. When he goes on to talk about what Fabius Maximus actually did, his own narrative undermines this point, that the consul who had appointed him, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, although he gave up his command to Fabius Maximus, handed over the army, Maximus told him to make himself ready in case there was any naval trouble, and that he should take command of the fleet. In other words, he retained his office. And Polybius also tells us that at the end of the year, when Fabius Maximus gave up his office, Servilius Geminus was there already, still in post as consul, to take over the command again. So his own narrative denies this, and all the other sources in Livy and so on make it absolutely clear that the other magistrates did not have to abdicate, but continued to exist under the dictator, and actually that they continued their commands and only had to give way to him if their commands coincided or conflicted with his. Now, this error of Polybius is interesting because, as textual critics know, and anyone who's tried to deal with a case of plagiarism will know, the most revealing thing that proves the point is when you come across an error. And if an error is reproduced in subsequent sources, then they are following the original source. hope I've explained that properly. Anyway, the Greek historians, this is extraordinary. All the Greek historians who write about Roman history make the same error. And I'll just go through this. Here we have Dionysius of Halicarnassus dealing with Cincinnatus and talking about a meeting of the Senate after the Decemvirate. Assembling in the Senate chamber about midnight, says one of the senators in a speech, you created a single magistracy with absolute authority over both war and peace, abrogating all the other magistracies. And before the day came, the most excellent Lucius Quinctius, let's say Cincinnatus, had been appointed dictator, although he wasn't even in the city at the time, but in the country, ploughing, as we know. Okay, so abrogating all the other magistracies, no, that did not happen. And was not part of it. That's the same error as Polybius has made. And then here we have Plutarch. In the 10th year of the war, this is the Valentine War, the Senate abolished the other magistracies and appointed Camillus dictator. No, they didn't. They appointed Camillus dictator, but the other magistrates continued. Then Plutarch, in the life of Mark Antony, he chose Antony, Caesar, chose Antony as his master of the horse, sent him to Rome. This office is second in rank when the dictator is in the city, but when he's absent, it's the first and almost the only one. For only the tribunate continues when a dictator has been chosen. All the other offices are abolished. And in another passage, which I haven't given you, in the Roman Questions, Plutarch talks about tribunes and says they're not really magistrates, as is witness the fact that when there's a dictator, all the other magistrates have to abdicate, but the tribunes don't. Now, this is extraordinary. And I'll take you back to the passage of Polybius, of course, is more than a century earlier than any of these later authors. The passage in question says the dictator's got 24 lictors, etc., and he has absolute powers. All the other magistrates, except the tribunes, cease to hold office on his appointment. Now, Mommsen, quite rightly, obviously, said that it's Polybius who must be the source of this error in the other Greek historians. But I don't think it's likely that this little aside in the account of the Battle of Trasimene is necessarily going to be the passage that everybody would turn to when looking for information about the dictatorship. And Polybius gives us this very interesting clue at the end of the passage. However, I will deal with this subject in greater detail later. This is in Book 3. This must be a reference, of course it must, to his account of the Roman Constitution in Book 6, which, alas, only survives in fragments. There is a possibility that this is one of those cases where a historian says he's going to deal with it in another place and then doesn't do so. But I think in this case, it's almost certain that Polybius did deal with the dictatorship in Book 6, that that was where he gave his account of the development of the constitution in the so-called Archaeologia, and where he will have, I think, undoubtedly talked about the creation of the various magistracies and so on, and must have dealt with the dictatorship there and what it was and how it worked and so on. And Polybius, of course, writing for Greek readers, is the only person who actually writes about the Roman constitution as a sort of an account that will be a general account for readers who are not familiar with it. And his account in Book 6 would be the go-to place for any later Greek historian who wanted an account in Greek of how the Roman constitution worked. So I think it's as near as certain that actually when Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Plutarch and Appian talk about the dictatorship and make this, as I say, egregious error, they must be referring, they must have got it from the passage in Book 6 where Polybius dealt with the origins of the dictatorship and the character of the dictatorship there. Which I think is interesting because it tells us something that we otherwise would not have known about the content of the constitutional history at the beginning of Book 6. But in more general terms, it explains, I think, something about the dictatorship in general, that when Polybius was writing, let's say 150 BC, looking back to the time of Fabius Maximus, and then having to tell his readers something about the dictatorship, he was dealing with an institution that was already at the time of Fabius Maximus something that had to be revived, and he himself had not witnessed it, and certainly not at the time of Fabius Maximus, and nor had any of his successors until the time of Sulla. In other words, general ignorance about what the general nature of the dictatorship was, I think, can be assumed at the time of Polybius. It's an anachronistic revival even at the time of Fabius Maximus. By the time of Sulla, of course, there's nobody left who knew anything about the dictatorship. They had to go by what Sulla himself told them and by what the antiquarian scholars, if Sulla had any, were helping him with. And he created this autocratic regime with a dictator with unlimited power, right of life and death, etc., etc. And that has had its effect as well on the tradition about the dictatorship. The Roman historians themselves really were all looking back. Even Fabius Pictor, at the time of Trasimene, was looking back to something that had long ceased to function. And the only thing that they had was a record in the Fasti and an oral tradition dealing with people like Cincinnatus, which I think in some ways has completely falsified the whole picture. So it's not surprising that the sources get this wrong. And I think some of these things can be explained. And this little example from Polybius, I think, explains it. We can actually see the way in which an error has crept in and then the influence that it has. Also, I think it tells us a great deal about the influence of Polybius on later historians. And it's extraordinary that they just went to him automatically if they wanted to know anything about the way the Roman system worked. Okay, I'll finish with that. I think I've got one more slide just to show you the Capitoline Fasti and how that records some of this information. You can see there, this is Camillus's fourth dictatorship. Here we have Manlius Capitolinus, who was dictator, and then here we have this unique entry, seditienis sedandi et rei gerundi causa, and then his magister equitum, who was Licinius Calvus, primus e plebe. So very interesting little things in the Capitoline Fasti of what this dictatorship was about. This is 368, is it? 368 Varronian, Manlius Capitolinus, appointed dictator to calm a sedition, and he chose a magister equitum from the plebs at the first time. And what he actually did was try to calm the sedition rather than to suppress it. And this is what all dictators who were appointed for internal reasons actually did. They always acted as conciliators rather than as agents of patrician oppression. So that's just another little point, but I just thought I'd show you that, just to show you the source of some of this information about the titles of the dictators. Okay, so I'll finish there and open this to discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's wonderfully rich and thought-provoking paper. I open the floor to questions and comments. Perhaps the best way forward is for people to just to register their interest in asking a question through the chat function. I suppose while colleagues collect their thoughts, I'll have a quick question of the many that one could ask. At some point, you referred to the dictatorship of Fabius Maximus as an anachronistic revival.
Yes.
Did I catch
yes,
that?
exactly.
Can you flesh out that very generally interesting assessment of it a bit more? It's an anachronistic revival, and yet it does occur at a time, I think, unquestionably, of real crisis.
That's right.
So it's also
I think,
a departure from earlier practice. What goes on there?
well, first of all, it was a real crisis. I mean, the Battle of Trasimene, my goodness. When they were virtually in despair, and they had to decide what to do. The consul had been killed, that's important, and they needed somebody to take command, and Fabius had no doubt been giving them his advice all along, and they decided that this is the guy, and that to give him the unified command in the name of the dictatorship would be to revive something that had always had that function. But actually, there had been no proper dictator re gerundi causa for nearly 100 years. There was one in the First Punic War, the only one who ever operated outside of Italy, guy who was, I've forgotten his name even, appointed in Sicily, and he achieved nothing worthy of note, according to the sources that we've got, Dio and Zanarus. Otherwise, there's Hortensius, the dictator of 287, 285, we don't even know his date, who produced the famous law about plebiscites. He was no doubt re gerundi causa, or possibly seditionis sedandi causa. There was a secession, wasn't there, in 287, and he was appointed dictator. But they are the only ones between, I think, about 307 and 217. So 100 years have gone by, and I think the answer was that stories like Cincinnatus perhaps did make people feel, well, we could always have a dictator. That's what Cincinnatus was appointed for. And so Fabius was then appointed, but it didn't work, did it? I mean, after Fabius' 6 months were up, he gave up, and then in 216 they appointed Junius Pera as a dictator again, but he achieved nothing. And anyway, you then have the Battle of Cannae, and they went back to appointing pro-magistrates and allowing consuls to reiterate. So Fabius was consul again, and they obviously felt, let's go back to the tried and trusted method, which I think was always the method, that is of making the consuls command the armies. And if you need the best person to be consul, then let's elect Fabius consul. I don't know if John Rich would agree with me on any of that, but I see he's there. Hi, John.
Yes, he has a question for you, but Kerry Barber.
Oh yes, sorry.
On briefly on the point that so perhaps I'll let him skip the queue. Kerry, please.
Thank you. It was a fantastic talk. I wonder if you saw this as part of a sort of autocratic streak within Fabius Maximus himself. That's sort of what I see happening during the Second Punic War in general. You have this sort of what I see as a sort of junta almost, mid-Second Punic War, where you have Fulvius Flaccus, you have Fabius and Marcellus virtually dominating the consulship for, I want to say, 10 years straight, either them or their son. And I wonder if Fabius, like his relatively unprecedented ending of the election of Ottocilius, right, where he stops the election, forces the redo, and he becomes consul while he's holding the election himself. If this is part of sort of a, I don't know, his sense of dominating the political landscape, recreating the dictatorship in a way that's going to make it more powerful, perhaps for his own benefit. I mean, of course, also for the benefit of the Republic in the midst of a crisis, I suppose, right? We don't have to be too cynical about this. But I wonder if you saw this as a redrawing of lines, in a sense, in the midst of the Second Punic War and this grab for power.
Yeah, I think I absolutely take the points you're making. I think Fabius almost certainly did want to get his hands on power and to exercise supreme command in one way or another. And I think the dictatorship really was a failed experiment. And then they went back to other means, but that he wanted to find some way of consolidating his power and continuing it, yes, without a doubt.
John Rich. You're on mute, I think.
Okay, now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right, okay, fine. Thank you very much, Tim. Actually, what I'd like to do is push back to the earlier period and ask sort of two related questions, Tim. And first of all, do you see a relationship between the very high use of the dictatorship in the sort of mid-4th century and the reintroduction of the consulship? I mean, it seems to me possible that there aren't so many in the early 4th century when you strip out the fictional ones of Camillus. And so it seems to me quite likely that when you had 6 or so consular tribunes to play with, there were always somebody around to knock a nail in or hold some elections. But when you come down to 2 chief magistrates, then you might be aware of a shortage, to which falling back on the tried and tested dictatorship as an extra person might prove very useful. And then as you get down to later in the century and you come up with brighter ideas like prorogation and so on, then obviously that gradually drops out of the picture. Now, that's first question, but my other problem is, and this is my real problem, your model is very good in so many ways, but I'm just not clear how the whole thing starts. Why should they institute a magistracy, which, as I understand, you do still think they had 24 lictors and greater imperium? Why institute something like that just in order to have a useful bloke around if you need an extra pair of hands? It seems to me that a different model might be something where you did create it in the 5th century for big important purposes, and it does get used like that occasionally because 2 major wars do get fought by dictators, the Algidus in 431 and of course Camillus at Veii. You might start it off like that, and then once you switch over to consular tribunes, which on the whole is a different thing, though occasionally they need supplementing by a bigger bloke, and then later on this existing institution can be used in a different way in the 4th century situation. Yes,
I think that's actually very interesting. The problem, of course, is that the 5th century is so obscure,
of course,
and difficult. I mean, it seemed to me more sensible to approach it the other way around, starting from what I think is a fairly secure record in the 4th century, and then looking at what was actually happening when we know there were dictators, rather than going back to the beginning. But of course, most historians who deal with the dictatorship are obsessed with the question of origins. How did this magistracy first arise? And there are endless numbers of possible explanations, that maybe when things go really bad, we've got to have a king for a temporary period, and that's what they're doing, or whatever. But of course, one very famous explanation, which I still quite like, is the idea that this has got something to do with the Latin League, that there is evidence that the leader of the Latin League was somebody called a dictator. Good old Cato has a fragment which has a Dictator Latinus, dedicating a sanctuary. So dictator may be something that signifies the commander of the Latin League, and that on occasions when the Latins went to war and needed a commander from Rome, such a person would then have the title of dictator. And this explains, this is sort of De Sanctis's idea, essentially. The dictator, two really important features of the dictatorship are they immediately explained. First of all, it's only occasional. You only have one when needed. That's to say, when the Latins need to go to war. So then we have a dictator. And secondly, it explains the short term, that is 6 months, that is for the campaigning season. And after that, it's all over. And that is the origin. The Romans then have this idea, well, let's us have a dictator if necessary.
Well, that's possible, but then personally, I'm rather attracted by what the sources tell us, that they decided to get rid of the kings and have 2 consuls, and then occasionally they felt they needed a single person to run the show. I'm not sure that isn't such a bad model after all myself. Well,
maybe, except that they've got 2 consuls, for goodness sake, and what's the matter with them, you know? Why on earth do we need, this is the way it works. One of the consuls is instructed to appoint a dictator on certain occasions. I mean, maybe if the Senate doesn't have confidence in the consuls, which is said to have happened, I think, in Livy at the time of Cincinnatus, because there's the one guy who is trapped with the army, but the other guy whose name, oh gosh, there's a horrible problem about this, isn't there? His name is Nautius, I think, but he's instructed to name the dictator. But he has to do so sort of in absentia because he's fighting a war against the Sabines. And it's a deputation from the Senate, as we saw in that 19th century picture, of 3 leading senators who have to go to Cincinnatus and fetch him from the plough. But why? You know, I mean, you've got a consul. Why can't he do it? And I don't see, you know, the original dictatorship. Of course, there's argument about who it was and what were the circumstances. Dionysius has this long and very, very interesting account of the dictatorship in Book 5. And he claims that the patricians were so fed up with the Lex Valeria, which meant that the plebs had a right of appeal against the decisions of a magistrate. So the magistrates' hands were tied. So I know, let's have a dictatorship with lots of lictors and no appeal, you know. Which doesn't actually match the record even in Dionysius, because in Dionysius, the chap they appoint, Larchius, goes off and fights a war against the Latins instead of oppressing the plebs. And when they ask him to do that, he says, well, they're all in debt and I feel sorry for them, and retires. So, you know, it's very strange, the accounts of the original dictatorship. And anyway, I don't think anybody had any secure information. But it is strange that they've got 2 consuls. What's the matter with them? Why do they have to have a dictator when there are 2 consuls out there with armies?
Yeah. We have a steady stream of questions, which is just what we want. Dominic Machado. Sorry to keep you waiting. Over to you.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed your take on the dictatorship. I was curious, again, to take this back to Fabius Maximus. Livy says this is not the first time that Fabius Maximus holds the dictatorship. There's this question of some earlier Fabian dictatorship. We're missing the Fausti for the years before, so we miss out on that. And it seems like also leading up to that, there's 2 more dictators in the decade prior. And, you know, this is following, you know, I think your point about the lack of magistrates who can actually perform certain functions is an important one. But post 242, we have the addition of the second praetor. So how do you think what happens in, say, 231 or 224 or 221 or impacts the way that Fabius reimagines himself in the wake of Trasimene?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point. We know that Fabius was dictator before this because I think you may mention it, as you say, but it's also in his Elogium in the Augustan Forum that he was dictator twice or whatever. And the first dictatorship, as you say, is not otherwise known, and it must therefore have taken place in the period for which we don't have any record, that is the years 221, 220. And it's always assumed that he was a dictator for a ritual purpose, you know, for knocking the nail or for holding elections, possibly for holding elections, which is the case with all the known dictators in the 3rd century anyway. Yes, of course, there's the story in Valerius Maximus, I think it's Valerius Maximus, where the dictator has to be appointed at night and in complete silence. And if there's any noise, then the thing is invalid. And that's what happened to Fabius the first time, because a mouse squeaked, apparently. And because of the squeaking of this mouse, his dictatorship was, although he'd been appointed, it was then declared invalid and they had to get somebody else, which is one of those silly stories. But that's, I think that fits into the pattern in the sense that the dictatorships you're talking about are all assumed to be, I mean, the ones where we have no information at all other than there were dictators, they are assumed to have been for ritual or routine purposes. I mean, I'm making that assumption as well, I admit.
Question from Bunny Waring.
Hi there. Apologies for the lack of camera. I have poor signal where I currently am. Thank you for a really interesting talk. It was very enjoyable. I just wanted to get some more, pick your brain really, a bit more about the complications you mentioned of the ancient authors were using earlier concepts of dictatorship.
Yes.
I wondered what impact you thought the context of what an emergency actually was aided Sulla's eventual version of power. So what I mean is, the development of the empire during the late Republic would have defined what an emergency actually was, especially with a sort of more settled idea of consular power, in comparison to the early Republican dictatorship. So going from someone who's, puts nails in walls and has military requirements, but is fairly small, going to someone who essentially can convince an entire group of people that are supposed to be in power that he has ultimate power. So perhaps with this reiteration by ancient authors that the dictatorship was somebody that was put in a position during a situation of emergency rings true. It's not that they've necessarily got an error there. It's just that their concept of what a Roman concept is of what an emergency is develops as the empire develops.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, of course, by the late Republic, they have got another type of emergency measure, which is the so-called ultimate decree of the Senate, where the consuls are able to use what we would call emergency powers. The Senate sort of decrees that whatever you do for the benefit of the state will support you. That's the essence of the decree, isn't it? And that does sound very much like a state of emergency, and that's what Gregory Golden goes on about in his book. He's much better on that than he is on the dictatorship. So there are ideas of emergency coming along and what you have to do in such cases. There's also the story that at the time of Tiberius Gracchus, there was talk of making Scipio Aemilianus a dictator. Now, this appears in Cicero, is it? I mean, he mentions it in the De Republica. And I think people have argued about this. I mean, it's post-Sulla, the reference. So is it an anachronism or is it not? Nicolay famously argued that it's not an anachronism and that actually this is a genuine piece of information and that Scipio really was considered as a possible dictator at that time. It's also speculated that Cicero might be referring to Pompey as well as a possible dictator in 52, remember, when he was sole consul.
Thank you. I think that's what I was interested in, is that where's the gap there? How is it that Sulla's managed to implement something? I strongly suspect he wasn't the first person that necessarily had the idea to turn this into something useful more towards an individual prospect than a state prospect. But how is he so much more successful at this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Sulla was so ruthless, and he actually had the de facto power. The only question was how was he going to present it and how was he going to wrap it up in a legalistic sort of way? And he went through this charade of getting an interrex to propose a law, which gave him these exceptional powers. I mean, it's not for me really to be talking about this with Federico in the room, but still, you are right. I mean, what is Sulla's thinking and what was his view of the dictatorship? Why did he go for it? And so on. It is a very, very interesting question.
Perfect. Thank you so much for a good talk.
Oh, thank you.
We have a comment on Polybius by Bishop Priscillianus of Avila.
I think you're muted.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Pedro. This was a joke about a joke that has taken too long to fix. Sorry for that. Yes, well, briefly, the comment is that I think that there is the possibility that Cicero, in his treatise on laws and the Legibus, may have said something similar to what Polybius said. No, is that possible? No, that when he says that when a dictator is appointed, all the other magistracies nesunto, no, they do not exist anymore, or something like that.
That's right. Now there's something to do with the text here, isn't it? Isn't this the suggestion of some scholar who wanted to move that statement to the end of the bit about dictator, whereas actually in the manuscript it belongs somewhere else.
Yeah,
I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
More about this than me.
There is different readings. Yeah,
I think in general, I must say I don't think it belongs there.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is that in all the information we've got about the dictators and what they did, including Polybius's narrative about Fabius Maximus, this does not happen. The magistrates continue to serve under the dictator if they or in a different theatre, and this is just simply a falsehood. Whether Cicero, I mean, that's the thing. If this movement of that piece of text is correct, which I very much doubt, then it would suggest that Cicero had made the same error.
Yeah. Well,
but he too, I mean, he knew perfectly well that Sulla appointed his own consuls and so on, or allowed the consulship to continue and the praetors and so on. So it's certainly not true of Sulla. But otherwise, what would Cicero know about the dictatorship? Unless he'd read it in Polybius, of course, who's one of the sources for the De Republica, without a doubt. So, I mean, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roman Frolov.
Yes, thank you very much, team, for the talk. I have just two short comments. One is perhaps a little bit more in the direction you are suggesting, and the one is perhaps a little bit against this direction. I don't know. But the one is that you said, as I understood, that can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah, yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The one of your comments was that after the emergence of pro-magistracy, the dictatorship got into decline, partly because of this. Yes. So I just wonder, in this case, the problem with the pro-magistracy is that it was developed as an instrument outside the sphere, the civil sphere. And so if pro-magistracy was doing something helpful instead of dictatorship, then what can we do with the civil authorities, with the problems, which dictators apparently, allegedly, were also responsible for? Because the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, as a kind of counterpart, is an addition to pro-magistracy, and together as two instruments instead of dictatorship, was only developed later a little bit. So I wonder if there was something more which dictators could do than pro-magistracy got into decline.
I do think the pro-magistracy is so much is a much better, from the Senate's point of view, a much better mechanism than instructing the consul to appoint a dictator, especially if the consul isn't available. He's maybe in the south of Italy conducting a campaign. If you can appoint pro-magistrates, that's much more convenient, and the Senate can appoint who they want and define their provincia, etc. And it's very striking to me that at the point where the Senate starts appointing pro-magistrates, dictators, re gerundae causa, sort of vanish from the record. And the only reason you have dictators from now on is for these ritual or routine purposes. And I think that is very striking. You know, you wouldn't have a program. I wouldn't have thought for knocking the nail into the wall of the temple. I mean, a ritual dictator is the ideal appointment for such a task. Yeah. Whereas for a serious task, commanding an army or something, then obviously a proconsul is what you want.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and another thing which probably plays more into the direction which you are suggesting, you were mentioning that the abdication of other magistrates at the time of the appointment of the dictator is certainly not the case. And you mentioned our Greek sources which report this kind of alleged abdication with, I think with the verb kataluen or something.
Yes, that's right.
But if we, if we have a look at the use of such terminology in the 1st century BC for alleged abdications, or rather depositions, we may notice that, at least it's my impression, that actually even then the deposition didn't happen, and such verbs could be used to indicate the practical loss of power rather than something you mentioned too, that in face to face the dictator kind of a loss of authority at the point of time and in precise place where they were working together, but not the general loss of authority. So I think that maybe these kind of notions are not even a problem, and do not suggest necessarily that there's some kind of real official abdication, deposition, or something like that happen.
I'm not sure. I mean, in Plutarch, for instance, both in the Questiones Romanae and in the Life of Antony, he says the tribunes are the only magistrates. There are no other magistrates. I don't think that can just simply be a reference to the sort of relative powerlessness of magistrates operating under a dictator. I think it really is a genuine statement that they have done away with, you know, rather as with the Decemvirate, you know, the semi-mythical event of the middle of the 5th century, when 10 men are appointed, the consuls and the tribunes of the plebs, everybody else are given the sack, and that's they are the only magistrates and they have no appeal, etc. And the same language is used of them. So I think this does mean, I think the Greek sources are definitely under the impression that when there's an emergency, you suspend the whole constitution, all the magistrates, and have just a dictator. And it's wrong. I mean,
well, not only in Plutarch, but also in Polybius as well. I think that he's suggesting that. Yeah, definitely that the other magistrates just have to go.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I also has a quick comment on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Federico sent me a message saying I could barge in. I don't know. I find Roman's point very convincing that if you just take the Polybius alone, it could either be interpreted the way that Roman wants, that it's just that the power of the other magistrates is decreased, which makes a level of sense, but for your interpretation of the Punic War dictatorships, or that he and then the others are relying on some other source. I mean, what struck me is that if this was all happening 200 years later, the obvious interpretation would be that they've all got hold of some piece of rhetoric where someone says, "Oh, you are abrogating the power of all the other magistrates," and taken it seriously, you know?
Yeah.
So if it really is traced back to a single error, either in Polybius or perhaps in someone else's reading of Polybius, I think the problem, I think Roman's solution of the problem works really well.
Okay. I mean, I think I'll have to go and look at these things again. I mean, maybe you're right, maybe, but I do think it's strange. I do think it's strange that all the Greek sources.
Well, but I mean, what's the most strange to me, and I have had some connection problems, so it may be that I missed you talking about this at greater length. But I mean, if it is a real mistake about the Constitution, and where on earth does it come from? It's such a weird mistake to start with.
Well, I think it's an indication of how mysterious the dictatorship was, that nobody really had any experience of what a dictator was like or what happened when there was a dictatorship, and somebody thought, well, this is how it must have worked, and that under Fabius Maximus, I mean, which already is in the distant past for Polybius, who was not there in 217, let's face it. He's only got what he's been told, that he has brought in this error, I think. Maybe not. I mean, I read carefully the report of what happened when Fabius met the existing consul, Servilius Geminus, and contrasted what Plutarch, I mean, I didn't go into it in this detail, but both Plutarch and Appian say that when they met, Servilius was told to give up his fasces and things, and told, you are now a private citizen, idiotes. Okay, that's in Plutarch, and then Appian says something very similar. I think Appian says he was no longer consul, etc. Whereas Polybius, of course, says something different, namely that he's taking over his command and instructing him to go back to Rome, where he's to prepare himself in case of any naval engagements, etc. And then Servilius does go off and command a fleet, etc. So I thought, well, Plutarch and Appian have somehow got the wrong end of the stick here. Polybius's narrative is perfectly okay. It's only in the aside where I think he's just done it carelessly without thinking what's actually coming, because it's from his constitutional section that he thinks this is the way dictatorship works and so on, and then has just inserted this. I also think it's very unlikely that Fabius Maximus had 24 lictors, actually. But there you go. Is that at all persuasive, Amy?
No, I mean, you know, this is stuff that is sort of is all over the place.
Well, isn't it just? Yes.
Question from Brad Jordan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a really, really interesting paper. My question is sort of taking us back to this issue where, if I understand you correctly, you're sort of arguing for military dictatorships, for want of a better term, being sort of a 3rd century revival or innovation. And this idea that maybe the Maes Imperium is coming out of these military emergencies in the Second Punic War. And I just wonder, and this, you know, embarrassingly might be more of a comment than a question, whether it might be worth considering the first Punic War example as being the sort of turning point at where this becomes a possibility. Because if I recall correctly, the limited material we have around this suggests that the reason for a dictatorship being named in the first place is a loss of confidence in the leadership of the consul by the Senate, and the small matter of sacrilege. And what's perhaps more interesting about this is the fact that the consul Pulcher actually names his own freedman as dictator initially.
Yes,
right.
That's right. Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah. So I just wonder whether the sort of, I mean, obviously the record we have is incredibly fragmentary. We don't know much about this, but I just wonder whether the rhetoric around that might be a good place to think about where sort of dictatorial supremacy might come in and that sort of thing.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I'd actually forgotten that. I mean, that really bizarre case of where he wants to appoint his own freedman as dictator. Is it Glicius or Glicia? Or it's got some name like that. I thought you were referring to the other guy, Caetinus, who was appointed to a military command in Sicily and achieved nothing. Yeah. I mean, this is really problematic because, of course, our sources for the First Punic War are so poor. but you're right, that might well be a sort of turning point. Although I personally, I still think the discovery of pro-magistracies and things have more or less put the old dictatorship in abeyance. But there are revivals, as you say, it might have been some sort of loss of confidence. That's a very good point.
Thank you very much.
I note a comment by David Rafferty again on the apparent misunderstanding of Polybius, but it's not a question, it's a comment, he says. Yeah. And we have a question though from Michele Bellomo.
Yes, thank you very much. Just coming back on the 4th century dictatorship, and we have the appointment of 3 dictators in a row between 362 and 360, and they all fight alongside with the consuls. I mean, they are appointed because the consuls are already engaged in the field. And this thing happened again in 365 when we have the first plebeian dictator. And then it never happens again. We have in 350 and 349 the praetors fighting alongside with the consuls. And then we have the pro-magistrates from 339. So what I was thinking about, what I was trying to ask you, if you think that this evolution has something to do also with conflict of the orders, and so with the, the fear to have 2 plebeian magistrates with imperium and only 1 patrician. So.
Yes, I'm sure it does. I mean, I just wish we knew, had more reliable information. But the first dictators holding the Comitiorum Habendorum Causa are in the late 350s and early 340s, aren't they? And all of them seem to be patricians who are trying to organize the elections in such a way that the plebs, the people, elect 2 patricians. And that's a very interesting idea, that you appoint a dictator to hold the elections and that can somehow make it easier to contrive 2 patricians rather than 1 of each. So these things are definitely there in the story of the struggle of the orders. I mean, the 362 case, Canusius is killed in battle, and the patricians say, well, he was the first plebeian to lead an army under his own auspices. It just shows that what the gods think of this. They've given him his cupuppas, and they appoint a patrician to be dictator, Appius Claudius. Of course, this has got something to do with it, but we don't really know quite what.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Well, it seems to me that it's been a tremendously rich discussion, very much testimony to the richness of the paper, of the argument that he put forward, and indeed of the material that Tim talked us through. It's been a tremendous start to the 2021 series, and for that, I think we're all very grateful to Tim. Thank you very much indeed. And we are reconvening next Thursday with a paper by Ghislaine Studer. All welcome, as always. And again, Tim, thank you very much indeed.
Oh, no, thank you, guys. I've really enjoyed this, and very, very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, clapping doesn't quite work in this setup, but you know, there would be a very warm round of applause.
No, I wish we could go and have a drink, but I shall do so privately.
Likewise. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Federico. Thank you.